The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden cross that marked Sarah's grave. Jack Morrison knelt beside it, his calloused hands tracing the carved letters of his wife's name for what felt like the 1,000th time since she'd been laid to rest 6 months ago. The wildflowers he'd planted around the headstone had begun to bloom, their bright colors a stark contrast to the darkness that had settled in his chest. Jack had built their small ranch house with his own hands, every board and nail placed with love and dreams of the family they would raise together. Now, the silence inside those walls felt suffocating. The kitchen table where Sarah used to hum while kneading bread sat empty. Her rocking chair on the front porch remained still, no longer creaking with the gentle rhythm that had once been the soundtrack to his evenings. At 32, Jack looked older than his years. His dark hair had begun showing threads of silver, and deep lines etched the corners of his blue eyes. The tuberculosis that had taken Sarah had been merciless, and watching her fade away had aged him in ways that hard ranch work never could. He'd tried everything the traveling doctor had suggested, spent every penny they'd saved, but nothing had been enough. The other ranchers in the valley had stopped coming by with offers of help or invitations to Sunday dinners. They meant well, but Jack couldn't bear their pitying looks or the way conversations would halt when he entered a room. He'd become a ghost among the living, going through the motions of caring for his cattle and horses while his heart remained buried 6 feet underground. His closest neighbor, old Pete Martinez, lived 5 miles east and still made the journey once a week to check on him. Pete had lost his own wife years earlier and understood the weight of grief better than most. He would arrive with supplies from town and stay just long enough to ensure Jack hadn't given up entirely on living. The ranch itself was suffering from Jack's neglect. Fences needed mending. The barn roof leaked in 3 places, and weeds had overtaken Sarah's vegetable garden. The cattle grazed in pastures that grew smaller each week, as he couldn't find the energy to maintain the full spread. His prize stallion, Thunder, had grown restless from lack of proper exercise and training. Jack spent his days riding the fence line, checking water troughs, and moving cattle from one pasture to another. The physical work helped quiet his mind, but evenings were the worst. When the sun set and he had to return to the empty house, the memories would flood back. Sarah laughing at his terrible jokes, the way she would wait up for him when he had to stay out late with sick animals, her gentle touch when fever or injury laid him low. He'd started talking to her grave as if she could hear him, updating her on the mundane details of ranch life. He told her about the new calf that had been born with a white star on its forehead, just like the one she'd been so fond of. He shared his worries about the coming winter and whether he'd have enough hay stored up. Sometimes he would just sit in silence, watching the sun move across the sky, feeling closer to her in that quiet space than anywhere else. The Apache had been moving through the area more frequently that summer. Jack had seen their smoke signals rising from the distant mountains and found the occasional unshod hoofprint near his water sources. The tensions between the Apache and the white settlers had been escalating, with reports of raids on homesteads 50 miles south. Most of the ranchers had organized patrols and built higher fences around their property. But Jack felt too weary to care about his own safety. Pete had warned him repeatedly about staying vigilant. "Those Apache warriors won't care about your grief, Jack," he'd said during his last visit. "You need to keep your rifle loaded and your eyes open." But Jack had merely nodded and continued staring at the mountains. Part of him almost welcomed the idea of danger. At least it would be something other than the endless, hollow routine of his days. The late August heat had been particularly brutal that year. The sun scorched the grasslands until they turned brown and brittle. The creek that ran through Jack's property had slowed to barely a trickle, forcing him to dig a deeper well near the house. He worked shirtless in the blazing sun, his skin bronzed and scarred from years of outdoor labor. Sweat poured down his face as he hauled bucket after bucket of dirt from the growing hole. It was during one of these exhausting afternoons that Thunder began acting strangely. The stallion paced in his corral, ears pricked forward and nostrils flared as he stared toward the eastern ridge. Jack paused in his digging and followed the horse's gaze, squinting against the bright sunlight. He could see nothing unusual, just the shimmering heat waves rising from the baked earth. But Thunder's agitation continued, and Jack had learned to trust the animal's instincts over the years. He climbed out of the half-finished well and walked to the house to retrieve his rifle from above the fireplace. The weight of the Winchester felt foreign in his hands after months of disuse. He checked that it was loaded and stepped onto the front porch, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The afternoon stretched on without incident, but Jack remained alert. He finished his work on the well as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him painfully of Sarah's favorite sunset dress. She used to say that God painted the sky differently each evening, just to keep them guessing about tomorrow's beauty. As darkness approached, Jack secured his animals and made his usual evening rounds. The cattle had gathered near the water trough, their day of grazing finished. Thunder had finally settled but remained more alert than usual, occasionally lifting his head to test the air with his sensitive nostrils. Jack gave the horse an extra measure of oats and checked the gate latch twice before heading to the house. He lit a single oil lamp in the kitchen and prepared a simple meal of beans and hardtack. The food tasted like dust in his mouth, as it had for months, but he forced himself to eat for the sake of maintaining his strength. Through the window, he could see the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Sarah used to point out constellations to him, her finger tracing invisible lines between the points of light as she told him the stories behind their names. The sound came just after midnight, when Jack was lying sleepless in the bed that felt too large and too cold without Sarah beside him. It started as a low moan, barely audible above the night sounds of crickets and distant coyotes. At first, he thought it might be one of his cattle in distress, but the sound was too human, too filled with pain and desperation. Jack sat up in bed, his heart racing for the first time in months. The sound came again, definitely human, and definitely close to the house. He reached for his rifle and moved carefully to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was only a thin crescent, providing little illumination beyond the faint outlines of his immediate surroundings. Moving as quietly as possible, Jack made his way to the front door and eased it open just enough to listen. The moaning had stopped, but he could hear something else now. The soft shuffle of movement near his front steps. Someone or something was on his porch, and from the labored breathing he could detect, they were badly injured. Jack's mind raced through possibilities. It could be a trap, with Apache warriors waiting in the darkness for him to lower his guard. But the sounds of distress seemed too genuine, too desperate to be feigned. His conscience, dormant for months under the weight of his grief, began to stir. Sarah would never have hesitated to help someone in need, regardless of the potential danger to herself. Taking a deep breath, Jack opened the door wider and raised his rifle. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm armed, so don't try anything foolish." The response was another low moan, followed by what sounded like a word in a language he didn't recognize. Jack stepped onto the porch, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. Gradually, he could make out a shape huddled against the wooden railing near the steps. It appeared to be a person, small in stature, wrapped in what looked like a torn blanket or clothing. "Don't move," Jack warned, keeping his rifle trained on the figure while he went back into the house to fetch his oil lamp. The light revealed what he hadn't expected to see. A young Apache woman, her dark hair matted with blood, her buckskin clothing torn and stained. She was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering open and closed as she struggled to remain alert. Jack stood frozen for a moment, his rifle still aimed at her, despite the obvious fact that she posed no immediate threat. This was an Apache, one of the people his neighbors feared and despised, yet she was clearly in desperate need of help. Her left shoulder appeared to be wounded, and there was a gash across her forehead that had bled extensively. The woman's eyes opened fully and met his, and Jack saw something there that struck him like a physical blow. It was the same look he'd seen in Sarah's eyes during her final weeks, a mixture of pain, fear, and desperate hope. The same vulnerability that had made him promise to never give up, to find a reason to keep living even after she was gone. For several long moments, they stared at each other across the flickered light of the oil lamp. Jack's finger remained on the trigger of his rifle, but his resolve to protect himself at all costs began to waver. This wasn't a warrior come to steal his horses or burn his house. This was a woman, alone and injured, who had somehow made it to his doorstep in her darkest hour. The decision, when it came, surprised Jack with its suddenness. He lowered his rifle and set the lamp on a nearby table, then knelt beside the wounded woman. Up close, he could see that she was young, probably no more than 20, with high cheekbones and skin the color of burnished copper. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and when he gently touched her uninjured shoulder, she flinched but didn't pull away. "Easy," Jack murmured, the same tone he used with frightened horses. "I'm not going to hurt you." He didn't know if she could understand English, but something in his voice seemed to calm her slightly. Her eyes remained fixed on his face, searching for signs of his intentions. Jack carefully examined her wounds by lamplight. The shoulder injury appeared to be from a bullet that had passed through the fleshy part above her collarbone. It was bleeding but didn't seem to have hit anything vital. The head wound was more concerning. A deep gash that would need cleaning and stitching to heal properly. She had other scrapes and bruises visible on her arms and legs, suggesting she'd been running or riding hard before whatever had injured her. The practical part of Jack's mind warned him about the dangers of helping her. If other Apache found out he was harboring one of their women, they might see it as kidnapping rather than rescue. If his white neighbors discovered an Apache woman on his property, they would assume the worst about his loyalties and motivations. Either way, he was risking his own safety and reputation. But as he looked into her pain-filled eyes, Jack realized he didn't care about any of that. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something other than emptiness and despair. This woman needed help, and he was the only one in a position to provide it. Sarah had always believed in showing kindness to strangers, regardless of their background or circumstances. Maybe this was the sign he'd been unconsciously waiting for. A chance to honor her memory by living according to the values she'd taught him. "Let's get you inside," Jack said softly, sliding one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She was lighter than he'd expected, and he was able to lift her easily, despite her resistance. She tried to speak, the words coming out in rapid Apache that he couldn't understand, but her tone suggested both gratitude and apprehension. Jack carried her into the house and laid her gently on the sofa that Sarah used to claim for her afternoon sewing. The irony wasn't lost on him that the first person to occupy that spa Jack worked by lamplight, his hands steadier than they'd been in months as he cleaned the Apache woman's wounds. She remained conscious but barely responsive, occasionally wincing when he touched a particularly tender area. The bullet wound through her shoulder was clean, which meant less risk of infection, but the head injury worried him more. He'd seen enough ranch accidents to know that head wounds could be unpredictable. As he worked, Jack found himself studying her face. She was beautiful in a way that was entirely different from Sarah's soft, pale features. Where Sarah had been delicate and fair-haired, this woman was strong-boned and dark, with the kind of beauty that spoke of survival and resilience. Her hands, though slender, bore the calluses of someone accustomed to hard work. There was a small scar above her left eyebrow that suggested this wasn't her first encounter with violence. "What's your name?" Jack asked softly as he applied a bandage to her forehead. She looked at him with confusion, and he realized she likely didn't understand English. He pointed to himself and said, "Jack." Then, he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows in question. She seemed to understand his gesture and whispered something that sounded like, "Ayana." Jack repeated it back to her, and she nodded slightly before closing her eyes. The effort of staying awake was clearly exhausting her, and Jack decided the rest of his questions could wait until morning. He covered her with Sarah's favorite quilt, the one with the star pattern that had taken her 2 winters to complete. For a moment, guilt washed over him. It felt like a betrayal to use something so precious to comfort a stranger, especially an Apache woman. But then he remembered Sarah's voice, gentle but firm. Every person deserves kindness. Jack. That's what makes us human. Jack spent the night in the kitchen chair, his rifle across his knees and his ears alert for any sound that might indicate danger. Every hour, he checked on Ayanna, noting with relief that her breathing remained steady, and her fever seemed to be subsiding. As dawn approached, he allowed himself to doze fitfully, one eye always on his unexpected guest. The morning sun streaming through the windows woke him, and Jack's first conscious thought was surprise that he'd made it through the night without incident. Ayanna was awake, her dark eyes following his movements as he stood and stretched his stiff muscles. She tried to sit up, but gasped with pain, her hand instinctively moving to her wounded shoulder. "Easy," Jack said, moving to help her. "You need to rest," he mimed, lying back down, and she seemed to understand. Though her expression remained wary, trust would clearly take time to build between them. Jack prepared a simple breakfast of eggs and biscuits, surprised to find that his appetite had returned along with his sense of purpose. He brought Ayanna a cup of water and some soft bread, noting how carefully she watched his every movement. When he offered her the food, she hesitated before accepting it, as if expecting it to be poisoned or taken away at any moment. Over the next few days, a tentative routine developed between them. Jack would tend to her wounds each morning and evening, amazed at how quickly she was healing. Apache women, he'd heard, were raised to be as tough as their men, and Ayanna was proving that reputation well-founded. She began sitting up on the second day and was able to walk short distances by the fourth, though she still moved carefully to avoid reopening her shoulder wound. Communication remained a challenge, but they began to develop a system of gestures and simple words. Jack learned that Ayanna meant eternal blossom, and that she was indeed young, perhaps 19 or 20 years old. She seemed fascinated by his attempts to pronounce Apache words, and would occasionally smile when his pronunciation was particularly mangled. Those smiles did something unexpected to Jack's carefully guarded heart. For months, he'd convinced himself that he would never feel anything but grief again, that Sarah had taken all capacity for joy with her when she died. But Ayanna's rare smiles sparked something that felt dangerously close to warmth in his chest. On the fifth day, while Jack was checking on his cattle, he returned to find Ayanna attempting to clean the kitchen. She had washed the dishes and was trying to sweep the floor despite her injured shoulder. When she saw him watching, she froze, as if expecting anger or punishment. "You don't have to do that," Jack said gently, but she didn't understand his words. He took the broom from her hands and gestured for her to sit down. The confusion in her eyes told him that perhaps kindness without expectation of service was foreign to her recent experience. That evening, as Jack changed her bandages, he noticed other scars on her arms and back, old ones that spoke of a hard life and possibly abuse. His jaw tightened as he wondered what circumstances had brought her, injured and alone, to his doorstep. When she caught him looking at the scars, she pulled her clothing closed defensively, but not before he saw shame in her expression. "Someone hurt you," Jack said, though he knew she couldn't understand the words. But something in his tone made her look up at him, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. Without thinking, he reached out and gently touched her hand. The tears spilled over then, and Ayanna wept quietly while Jack sat beside her, unsure what to do with his hands. It had been so long since he'd comforted anyone that the gestures felt rusty and uncertain. Finally, he offered her his handkerchief, and she took it gratefully, wiping her eyes and struggling to regain her composure. By the end of the first week, Jack realized he was going to have to make some decisions. Ayanna was strong enough to travel, but he had no idea where she would go or if she would be safe. More pressingly, old Pete was due for his weekly visit in 2 days, and Jack wasn't sure how to explain the presence of an Apache woman in his house. He tried to communicate his concern to Ayanna, using gestures to indicate that someone was coming and that there might be danger. She seemed to understand and became more alert and cautious. When he showed her his rifle and mimed hiding, she nodded grimly, as if she'd expected this moment to come. The solution presented itself sooner than expected. The next morning, Jack woke to find Ayana dressed and preparing to leave. She had packed the few belongings she'd arrived with and was wrapping bread and dried meat in a cloth bundle. When she saw him watching, she pointed to herself, then to the door, then to the mountains in the distance. "You're leaving," Jack said, surprised by the sharp pang of loss that hit him. She nodded and moved toward the door, but he stepped in front of her. "Wait," he said, holding up his hand. "It's not safe out there alone." Ayana tilted her head, clearly not understanding his words but recognizing the concern in his voice. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her tone urgent and frustrated that she couldn't make him understand. Finally, she pointed to her chest, then to the mountains, then made a walking motion with her fingers. She was telling him she had to go, that she had somewhere to be. Jack struggled with conflicting emotions. The practical part of him knew she was right to leave before Pete arrived or other neighbors came calling. Her presence put them both in danger, and he had no right to ask her to stay. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant for months, rebelled against the idea of her walking away. "I could take you," he found himself saying, gesturing toward his horse and then the mountains. "Wherever you need to go, I could take you safely." Ayana studied his face for a long moment, and Jack saw surprise there, followed by something that might have been hope. She spoke again in Apache, more slowly this time, and he caught what sounded like a question in her tone. When he nodded, not understanding her words but understanding her need, she seemed to make a decision. She moved to the window and pointed toward the eastern mountains, then held up 3 fingers and pointed to the sun. 3 days' ride east. Jack nodded again, already mentally preparing for the journey. It would mean leaving his ranch unguarded, but Pete would check on things if he found the place empty. And the truth was, Jack realized, he wasn't ready to say goodbye to Ayana yet. They left that afternoon, Jack on Thunder and Ayana on his gentler mare, Star. She rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, sitting straight despite her healing wounds. Jack had packed supplies for a week, not knowing what they might encounter on the journey or how long it would take to ensure her safe arrival at whatever destination she sought. As they rode through the afternoon, Jack found himself stealing glances at his companion. The open country suited her in a way that the confines of his house hadn't. Out here, she seemed more alert and confident, occasionally pointing out landmarks or signs that Jack's untrained eyes missed entirely. Her knowledge of the landscape was impressive, suggesting she'd traveled these routes many times before. They made camp that evening near a small stream, and Ayana surprised Jack by taking charge of many of the tasks despite her injuries. She gathered wood for the fire with quick efficiency and prepared their simple meal of beans and hardtack with skills that spoke of long experience. When Jack tried to help, she shooed him away with gestures that made him smile despite himself. After they'd eaten, they sat by the fire in companionable silence. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, brilliant with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Jack remembered similar evenings with Sarah, how she'd point out constellations and tell him their stories. The memory should have brought pain, but instead, it felt like a gentle acknowledgement of the past. "Sarah," Jack said suddenly, pointing to the sky, and then to his heart. Ayana watched him curiously as he struggled to explain. "My wife," he said, then covered his eyes and made crying motions. "Dead." Understanding dawned in Ayana's expression, followed by sympathy. She spoke softly in Apache, her tone gentle and sad. Then she pointed to herself and made similar gestures, indicating loss and tears. She had lost someone too, Jack realized. Perhaps that was part of what had driven her, injured and desperate, to his doorstep. They shared their grief without words. 2 people who had known love and lost it, finding comfort in their mutual understanding. When Ayana reached over and briefly touched Jack's hand, he didn't pull away. The contact was brief but significant, an acknowledgement of their connection and their shared pain. The second day of travel brought them into more rugged country, and Jack began to see signs of Apache presence. Smoke signals rose from distant peaks, and they occasionally spotted riders on far ridges who seemed to be tracking their progress. Ayanna appeared unconcerned by these sightings, which reassured Jack that they were probably encountering her own people rather than hostile strangers. Late in the afternoon, their peaceful journey was interrupted by the sound of gunshots echoing from the valley ahead. Jack pulled up his horse and reached for his rifle, but Ayanna grabbed his arm and shook her head urgently. She pointed toward a rocky outcropping and made hiding motions, clearly wanting them to avoid whatever conflict was occurring below. They led their horses up into the rocks and dismounted, with Ayanna moving forward to a vantage point where she could see into the valley. Jack followed, and what he saw below made his blood run cold. A small group of Apache warriors had surrounded a cavalry patrol, and from the bodies scattered on the ground, the soldiers had gotten the worst of the encounter. "We need to leave," Jack whispered. But when he turned to Ayanna, he saw tears streaming down her face. She was pointing at something in the valley, speaking rapidly in Apache with increasing distress. Jack followed her gaze and saw what had upset her. Among the Apache warriors below, one was gesturing angrily at another, and their body language suggested a serious disagreement. Suddenly, Ayanna was moving, scrambling down the rocky slope despite Jack's urgent whispers for her to stop. She seemed to have spotted someone specific among the warriors, someone whose presence changed everything about their situation. Jack had no choice but to follow, his rifle ready, but his heart pounding with the certainty that they were walking into mortal danger. As they approached the edge of the battlefield, one of the Apache warriors noticed their approach and shouted to the others. Immediately, several rifles were trained on Jack, and he realized that his decision to help an injured Apache woman was about to be put to the ultimate test. Ayanna called out in Apache, her voice carrying across the valley, and Jack heard a name repeated several times. Her name, he realized, spoken with surprise and something that might have been relief. The warrior who seemed to be the leader of the group rode toward them, his face a mask of suspicion and barely controlled anger. He spoke harshly to Ayanna, clearly demanding explanations for her presence with a white man. Her responses were equally rapid and intense, with frequent gestures toward Jack and what appeared to be passionate pleas or explanations. Jack stood motionless, knowing that his life hung in the balance of a conversation he couldn't understand between people whose customs and motivations were largely foreign to him. All he could do was wait and hope that his kindness to Ayanna would count for something in whatever judgment was about to be passed on him. C.E. Since Sarah's death was an Apache woman who represented everything his neighbors considered to be the enemy. But as he looked at her pale face and labored breathing, Jack saw only another human being in desperate need of care. He retrieved his medical supplies from the bedroom, the same bandages and medicines he'd used in a futile attempt to ease Sarah's suffering. His hands shook slightly as he prepared to clean the woman's wounds. Not from fear, but from the strange sensation of having a purpose again, after months of merely existing. The night stretched ahead of them, full of uncertainty and danger. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Jack Morrison felt truly alive. The Apache warrior chief studied Jack with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. His weathered face bore the scars of many battles, and his bearing spoke of a man accustomed to making life and death decisions. Behind him, the other warriors maintained their rifles aimed at Jack's chest, while they listened to Ayanna's rapid explanation. Jack could pick out only a few words from her passionate speech, but he heard his name mentioned several times, along with gestures toward her healing wounds. She was telling them how he'd found her and cared for her, he realized. Whether that would save his life, or merely delay his death, remained to be seen. The chief finally raised his hand for silence, and spoke directly to Ayanna. His tone was stern, but not unkind, and Jack caught what sounded like questions mixed with expressions of concern. When she answered, pointing again to her injuries and then to Jack, the chief's expression shifted slightly. Not to friendliness, but perhaps to a grudging curiosity. Then the chief turned to Jack and spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "You are the white man who found my daughter." Daughter. The word hit Jack like a physical blow. Ayanna was this formidable man's daughter, which explained both her resilience and the intense concern in his questioning. It also meant that Jack's fate rested in the hands of a father whose daughter he'd been alone with for over a week. "Yes," Jack replied, keeping his voice steady. The chief's eyes narrowed. "Many of your people would have. Many have." He gestured toward the battlefield behind him. "These soldiers came to take Apache women and children to the reservation. Many women. We stopped them." Jack's blood chilled as he realized what kind of patrol they'd encountered. The army had been increasingly aggressive about forcing Apache bands onto reservations, often using brutal tactics. If Ayanna had been fleeing from such a roundup, it explained both her injuries and her desperate arrival at his ranch. "She came to my door, hurt and afraid," Jack said carefully. "I gave her shelter and food and tended her wounds, nothing more." He met the chief's gaze steadily, knowing that any sign of deception would likely cost him his life. The chief spoke to Ayanna again, and her response was longer and more animated. She seemed to be defending Jack, her gestures emphatic and her tone pleading. At one point, she touched the bandage on her shoulder and spoke directly to her father, her voice breaking with emotion. When she finished, the chief was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he looked back at Jack. "My daughter tells me you could have taken advantage of her weakness. But you did not. She says you treated her with respect and kindness, asking nothing in return." He paused. "She also tells me that you have lost your woman recently, that you grieve as we grieve." Jack nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to speak about Sarah. "Ayanna was fleeing soldiers who killed her husband and tried to capture her for the reservation," the chief continued. "She has been hiding in the mountains for 2 moons, eating roots and sleeping in caves. When she was shot trying to steal food from a white settlement, she remembered hearing of a lonely rancher in the valley below. She hoped you might take pity on her." The revelation that Ayanna had been married, had lost her husband to the soldiers, added another layer to Jack's understanding of the woman he'd sheltered. She had sought him out not by accident, but as a desperate gamble based on his reputation for solitude. Somehow, word of his grief had reached even the Apache bands in the mountains. "I'm sorry for her loss," Jack said quietly. The chief's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You speak as one who knows such pain." He looked between Jack and Ayanna, who was watching their exchange with obvious anxiety. "My daughter owes you her life. This creates a debt that must be honored." Jack wasn't sure what that meant, but before he could ask, one of the other warriors called out urgently and pointed toward the southern ridge. A dust cloud was approaching fast, more soldiers, probably coming to investigate the gunshots. The chief barked orders in Apache, and his men immediately began preparing to leave. "You must come with us," the chief told Jack. "These soldiers will find their dead brothers and blame any white man they encounter. You are not safe here." Jack looked at Thunder and Star, grazing peacefully nearby, and made a split-second decision that would change the course of his life. "All right," he said, "but I need to get word to someone about my ranch, so they know I'm not dead." The chief nodded grimly. "This can be done. But we must go now." The next hour passed in a blur of rapid movement through increasingly rugged terrain. The Apache warriors moved like ghosts through country that would have challenged Jack even without the pressure of pursuit. Ayanna rode close to him, occasionally reaching over to touch his arm in what seemed like reassurance or gratitude. They climbed higher into the mountains as the afternoon wore on, following trails that were barely visible even to Jack's experienced eyes. Behind them, the dust cloud of the pursuing cavalry grew smaller, but never disappeared entirely. The soldiers were tracking them, but the Apache knew this country in ways that gave them a significant advantage. As evening approached, they reached a hidden canyon, where smoke from cooking fires revealed the presence of a larger Apache camp. Women and children looked up from their tasks as the warriors rode in, their faces showing curiosity about the white man in their midst. Jack felt their eyes on him but tried to maintain a respectful demeanor, knowing that his life still hung in the balance. The chief dismounted and spoke briefly to several of the older women, gesturing toward Jack and Ayanna. One of the women, her gray hair braided with silver ornaments that suggested high status. Approached them with keen interest. She examined Ayana's healing wounds with gentle hands and spoke to her in rapid Apache. "This is my mother," the chief told Jack. "She wishes to thank you for caring for her granddaughter. She says your medicine work is good." Jack nodded respectfully to the older woman, who surprised him by reaching out and briefly touching his hand while speaking softly in Apache. "She says you have sad eyes, like one who has lost much," the chief translated. "But she also sees kindness in you. She invites you to eat with our family." The meal that followed was unlike anything Jack had experienced. He sat cross-legged around a fire with Ayana's extended family, sharing roasted rabbit and some kind of bread made from ground acorns. The conversation flowed around him in Apache, but he caught Ayana's frequent glances and her grandmother's approving nods in his direction. After the meal, the chief invited Jack to walk with him to the edge of the canyon. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air, and the sounds of the camp settling for the night created a peaceful backdrop for their conversation. "My daughter has spoken much about you since we found her," the chief said without preamble. "She says you are alone in your big house, that you tend the grave of your woman every day." Jack felt heat rise in his cheeks. She couldn't understand what I was saying. Ayana understands more English than she speaks. And grief has its own language that needs no words. The chief was quiet for a moment. "She has asked permission to stay with you." One. The statement hit Jack like a lightning strike. "Stay with me? Her husband is dead. By our customs, she is free to choose a new path. She believes her path lies with you." The chief turned to study Jack's face in the starlight. Over one. And one. "The question is whether your path lies with her." Jack struggled to process what he was hearing. In the week since Ayana had collapsed on his doorstep, he'd felt more alive than he had in months. Her presence had awakened something in him that he'd thought died with Sarah. But the idea that she might want to build a life with him seemed too incredible to believe. "She barely knows me," Jack protested. "To let another woman into the heart you buried with your wife?" the chief interrupted. "Ayana knows this fear. She carries the same burden. But she also knows that life must go forward. That love honored is not love betrayed by loving again." The wisdom in those words pierced through Jack's defenses. Sarah would never have wanted him to spend the rest of his life alone, mourning what was lost, instead of celebrating what remained. She had believed in love's power to heal and transform, and she would have seen Ayana's arrival as a gift rather than a betrayal. "There would be complications," Jack said slowly. "My neighbors won't understand. Some of them would see her as a threat, and my people will see you as another white man stealing an Apache woman," the chief replied. "We will both face the anger of those who cannot see beyond old hatreds. But my daughter believes love is stronger than fear. Do you?" Jack thought about the past week, about how Ayana's presence had filled the empty spaces in his house and his heart. He thought about her gentle touch as she'd tried to help with chores despite her injuries, her tears when she'd shared his grief, her smile when she'd managed to make him laugh for the first time since Sarah's death. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think I do." The chief nodded as if he'd expected this answer. "Then you must understand what choosing this path means. Ayana cannot live safely in your white world, and you cannot live safely in ours. You must find a new way. Together." Over the following days, Jack learned more about what that new way might look like. There were other mixed couples living in the borderlands between Apache and white territories, creating small communities where such unions could survive. Some ran trading posts that served both peoples. Others found isolated ranches where they could raise families away from the prejudices of both societies. Ayana's grandmother, it turned out, had been married to a Mexican trader in her youth and understood the challenges they would face. She spent long hours talking with both Jack and Ayana, sometimes in English for his benefit, helping them think through practical considerations as well as emotional ones. The decision, when it finally crystallized, felt as natural as breathing. Jack woke one morning to find Ayanna sitting beside his sleeping blankets, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. When he opened his eyes, she smiled and spoke a single word in Apache that he'd learned over the past few days. "Yes," she had said, using one of her few English words. "Yes," Jack replied, understanding that they were both saying yes to a future that would be uncertain and difficult but no longer empty. The chief performed a simple ceremony that afternoon, binding their hands together with strips of leather, while speaking words in Apache that Jack couldn't understand but felt in his bones. Ayanna translated some of it for him later. Promises to honor each other's grief while building new joy, to face the world's anger with courage, to create a home where both their spirits could flourish. They left the Apache camp a week later, traveling north toward a valley the chief had described where several mixed families had established a small trading settlement. Jack's ranch would have to be sold or abandoned. But old Pete had agreed to handle the practical matters when the chief had sent a message explaining the situation. As they rode through the morning sunlight, Jack felt Sarah's presence with them not as a ghost but as a blessing. The woman he'd loved would have approved of Ayanna's strength and resilience. She would have seen the kindness beneath her different features and customs. Most importantly, she would have recognized that love given freely creates more love rather than less. Ayanna rode beside him with the confidence of a woman who had chosen her path without reservation. Sometimes, she would point out birds or plants and teach him their names in Apache. Other times they would travel in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's company and the promise of the unknown country ahead. The trading post they eventually established became known throughout the region as a place where Apache and white settlers could meet safely to exchange goods and information. Jack's skills with horses and cattle complemented Ayanna's knowledge of the land and its seasons. Together, they built not just a business but a small community where their children would grow up understanding both worlds. Years later, when Jack would visit the grave he'd made for Sarah beside their new home, he would bring flowers from the garden Ayanna had planted. He would tell Sarah about their life, their children, the peace they'd managed to build in a place where love had proven stronger than fear. And sometimes, when the wind was right, he could almost hear Sarah's voice, reminding him that the heart's capacity for love was infinite, that honoring the past meant embracing the future with open arms. The Apache woman who had fallen at his door had given him back his life, and in return, he had given her a home where she could heal from her own losses. Together, they had proven that love could bridge any divide, survive any hardship, and create beauty from the ashes of what came before.